Okay, I think we should get started. A reminder that a week from Thursday is our first exam, that you should all bring a blue book for that to write in. Blue books can be gotten, I think, at the bookstore or the hub, but do bring that. That's so that we don't have all sorts of loose papers, then which pages get lost. And that the graders can fold back the front with your name on it before they start grading, so they'll be grading quite anonymously, and that's just an easy way for us to handle that. So do each of you bring a blue book in which to write the exam. A week from today, Tuesday, we will be both sort of finishing up lecture and then have a part of the period to talk about the Marion Kaplan book. So you should have that read by next Tuesday, and some time for review to talk about what the nature of the exam, the format of the exam, my advice on how to think about preparing for that, and what to do when you get the exam on Thursday. So do keep in mind that have the Kaplan finished by next Tuesday, and do bring the blue book on a week from Thursday. One term that I forgot to mention or talk about last time was the Freikorps, and that this was a term used for a group of paramilitary units that emerged at the end of World War I. When the armistice was signed, most German soldiers immediately simply packed up and left and went home. But there were a fair number of people who, like Hitler, had not found the war to be a bad experience, did not want to end that experience. And in particular, now that they couldn't be fighting in France or abroad, wanted to continue the war at home, particularly against what they considered to be those who had stabbed Germany in the back, to engage in right-wing paramilitary politics. So a number of German officers, in fact, formed informal units of volunteers, and these were called the Freikorps, and that they played a role between 1919 and 1921, very much engaged on trying to block what they considered the traitorous democratization of Germany, carried out a number of assassinations of prominent German politicians. They say Germany had a wave of well over 400 political assassinations in the first several years after the end of the war. In Bavaria, in particular, carried out a coup against a left-wing government in the spring of 1919, and they were engaged also in the Russian Civil War, in the Baltic and elsewhere. In short, a fairly large number of both veterans on the one hand, but the other contingent in the Freikorps were young teenagers who had looked forward in going to the war, and the war ended too quick. And having been cheated out of their war, they couldn't wait to put on a uniform and get into the new internal war because they had missed the external war. It was among this group of people, clearly, that the Nazis in general and the SA, the brown shirts in particular, could recruit. By 1921, the Allies demanded the dissolution of the Freikorps as a violation of the disarmament provisions of the Versailles Treaty, seeing them as a covert army. And so many of those whose units were dissolved then joined paramilitary formations of various political parties, and many of the first generation of the SA were in fact Freikorps veterans. And so it was out of that atmosphere of violence and right-wing politics that many of the initial Nazi SA men and some of the initial Nazi leaders came. So that's what that term was, and it was I didn't mention it, but I should have, is trying to fill in kind of the atmosphere and context of Hitler and the rise of the Nazis in the early 1920s. Now, we had left off in 1930 when the Nazis had experienced their unpredicted and shocking electoral breakthrough, going from being a fringe party to the second largest party in Germany in September of 1930. Gobbling up the vast bulk of new voters and significant portions of middle-class parties that were decimated in that election, that the left wing, the communist and socialists generally held, The Catholic Party basically held its own, but the rest of the political spectrum was being won over to the Nazis in fairly rapid order. This, as I said, had left the Social Democrats, the mainstay of the Weimar Republic, with a lose-lose choice. They could either continue to oppose Brüning's austerity policies, which were creating vast unemployment, in order to not have further elections, or so they could oppose them, which would force the dissolution of Reichstag and yet another elections, which would open the door for even further Nazi advance, or they could abstain, allow Brüning to govern with his austerity policies, whose main cost, unemployment, was borne by the very constituency that was the basis of the Socialist Party, the German working class, and see those people in anger and frustration deserting the Socialist Party and moving to the left and swelling the ranks of the German Communist Party. Either way, the Socialists were going to lose, and in the end they decided, in a sense, the Nazis were a worse threat than the Communists. They decided to abstain, allow Brüning to rule harshly through presidential decree, not a majority government, not legislation passed by the Reichstag, but governing for 2 years through the emergency powers under Article 48 of the Constitution that allowed a presidentially appointed chancellor to rule as long as his emergency decrees were not vetoed by a majority in the Reichstag. That held the Nazis at bay in terms of national elections. It did not hold them at bay in terms of a whole series of local elections. The Nazis are running non-stop campaigns in virtually every election in Germany, from the most obscure mayor in every small town to county councils to the state elections. Germany is a federal system composed of a number of states, and that in all of these they are continuing to show power. And the fact that they have not peaked. Their momentum is still there. They are growing between 1930 and 1932. But Hitler is being shut out of translating that momentum into power in the Reichstag on the national level. What finally ends the stalemate and opens the door for the Nazis once again is that the 7-year presidential term of President Paul von Hindenburg comes to an end in the spring of 1932. And Hindenburg is at first puzzled why the great war hero has to even run for re-election. He should be simply acclaimed to continue in office. When people explain the Constitution to him and that terms do end, and that he really does have to run again, he isn't happy, and he decides, okay, he will run. He's now in his mid-80s, getting quite up there. And now the choice then falls to Hitler. Do you run against the war hero that has been elected by the German right, or do you stand aside and allow Hindenburg to be re-elected without opposition? And after some consideration, Hitler decides to throw the dice, and he will run against Hindenburg. The new right will challenge the old right for the presidency of Germany, and Germany has to go to the polls in the spring of 1932 in a nationwide presidential election with basically 3 candidates: Hindenburg, the war hero, Hitler, the Nazi, and the head of the Communist Party. In the end, Hindenburg certainly gets the most votes, but misses winning an outright majority by part of a percentage point. So he cannot be declared president. He has to have an outright majority. So a second round election is held in which the communist, the third voter, the communist is out, and Hitler goes head to head with Hindenburg, and Hindenburg gets his victory. He is reelected. But if you look at what happens here in the spring of 1936, the Nazis have more than doubled their voting from 6.4 million to 13.5 million, more than doubled their percentage of the German electorate. Even running against a conservative war hero, the Nazi vote goes up to 36%. So the Nazis, in a course of 2 years, have in fact proven now in the first national election since September 1930 that they're on a roll, that they have doubled. More than 1 out of every 3 Germans in free elections is voting for Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party. For Hitler, then, the issue is how do I translate this into power, not just symbolic victory. Symbolic victory is fine, but power is what he is after. And now it comes to a series of political maneuvers and negotiations between the spring of 1933 and January 30th, spring of 1932 and January 30th, 1933, that finally bring Hitler to power, in which there is a kind of mating dance between the old right and the new right. The old right and the new right both want to overthrow the Weimar Constitution. They both want to get rid of Weimar democracy. The old right wants an authoritarian, traditional authoritarian government, basically built around Hindenburg and his appointed cronies. And Hitler wants a populist, fascist government built around his electoral success. And the question is, neither can do it alone. Hindenburg cannot carry out a transformation of the Weimar Constitution, a de-democratization of Germany from above without any popular support. The army won't do it by themselves. And Hitler can't come to power unless he finds partners who open the doors for him. And so on their common grounds of they both want to bury the Weimar Republic, they both want to destroy the German left wing, the communists and the socialists, each wants to use the other for their own purposes. And so the real issue in this long mating dance or negotiation that takes place between the spring of 32 and January 30th of 1933 is who is going to con the other? Who is going to cut the deal that basically puts them on top and uses the other for their own purposes? Who's going to get suckered? This is really what we're talking about in all of this. The Weimar Republic, for all practical purposes, is dead. The issue is what will succeed it. It is not inevitable the Nazis will be the successor, even if it is virtually inevitable Weimar is gone. Resuscitating German democracy does not seem to be a likely alternative in the various scenarios that are there. But who picks up the pieces and who is the successor is the very open question. At this point, Hindenburg is very resentful that Brüning, 1, made him run for re-election, and 2, is a liability in terms of popularity. His austerity programs have gotten him named the Hunger Chancellor, not exactly a nice political label to have. So after the presidential elections, Hindenburg decides he will dump Brüning as a political liability and try to find somebody else to rule in his stead. And he chooses a minor Rhineland noble named Franz von Papen. And Franz von Papen will be kind of the front man, but his real advisor, the man who is really telling him what to do and calling the shots, is his closest military advisor. Remember, Hindenburg is an old field marshal, is a man named Kurt von Schleicher. So Schleicher is the man calling the shots behind the scenes, conducting the negotiations with the Nazis, and von Papen will be the front man, the man they want to appoint to replace Brüning, to unload the Hunger Chancellor as their political ballast. And Kurt von Schleicher basically decides the old guard, Hindenburg, and the old right need the Nazis. As Schleicher infamously said in the spring of 1932, if the Nazis did not exist, we would need to invent them. We have to find somebody that can drum up popular support for a right-wing cause. The communists and the socialists have broad electoral support. Hindenburg does not, in terms of deputies in the Reichstag. Somebody who can go out and win elections means you need a populist-like candidate, and that man is Hitler, and Schleicher is now ready to negotiate with him. And the agreement, the first agreement that Schleicher and Hitler reach in spring of 1932 is that Hitler will temporarily support the von Papen government, join in giving support to Hindenburg's newly appointed Chancellor, on the condition that in the summer the Reichstag will be dissolved and new nationwide Reichstag elections will be held, new parliamentary elections. So for a brief period of support, Hitler is demanding and getting the agreement of the old right to open the door to new national elections, and it is Hitler's hope that he can win an outright majority, that he will simply come to power through the tactics of legality. If the Nazis can continue to grow at the rate that they have been growing, it looks as if they could in fact come to power democratically elected with a real majority of representatives in the Reichstag. Now, here is where, however, proportional representation, the electoral system of the Nazis, begins to work against him. Up until now, proportional representation has created the instability of Weimar, that has created the kind of fertile soil in which the Nazis could thrive. Now, however, given the ability of three other parties, the Center Party, the Communists, and the Socialists, to hold on to their constituencies, it's going to make it almost impossible for Hitler to take that last step and leap from a plurality to a majority. And this is what comes out in the July election of 1932. The Nazis pull out all the stops. It's a non-stop campaign. There's all sorts of street violence going on. This is a period everyone, in a sense, knows the future of Germany is at stake. And when the votes are counted, the Nazis have incrementally increased on their spring vote. They've gone from another 250,000 votes up to 13.75. They are now up to 37.4%. And if you look at the delegates they now have, they zoom way out in front as by far the largest political party in Germany. They have 230 delegates. The SPD has fallen to 133, so they've lapped them by almost 100 delegates in the Reichstag. But nonetheless, with the Center Party holding and the Communists increasing, making up for the drop in the SPD, Hitler is locked down. He can get a plurality in Germany. He cannot get an outright majority. Now, in a sense there, the good news is that Hitler cannot come to power by a majority vote. The bad news is, if you add those figures up, more than half of Germany, more than 1 out of 2 Germans, is voting either for Adolf Hitler and the Nazis or a Stalinist Communist Party following orders from Joe Stalin in Moscow. They are voting for one or another totalitarian alternative. You cannot make a democracy work when over 1 out of every 2 people is voting for Joe Stalin or Adolf Hitler. Basically, that means democracy is done in Germany. Over half the population is opting for dictatorship. It's just that they have 2 different alternatives. They don't agree on what that dictatorship should be. Now, Hitler, now the leader of by far the largest party, and if this had been a vote, say, on the American system, where whoever got the largest vote in each district had gotten the delegate, the Nazis would have come to power in the summer of 32. If they had had a first man past the post electoral system, the Nazis would have had an outright majority of delegates in the Reichstag, elected by over 1/3 of the electorate, no one else close, and Hitler would have proclaimed himself democratically elected. But proportional representation has now become the barrier rather than the helper in terms of Nazi aspirations. He doesn't make it, and he goes in to see Schleicher and Hindenburg and demands to be made Chancellor of Germany. What other person could be? He's gotten over 1/3 of the vote. He's by far the most popular politician in Germany. No other party comes close. How can he not be invited to to attempt to put together a government and be installed as the new presidentially appointed Chancellor by Hindenburg? and this is his demand. He wants full power. Make me the presidentially appointed chancellor. And Hindenburg says basically, you see my face on the stamp? Well, lick the back. No, we're not going to appoint you chancellor. You didn't get a majority. You can be von Pappen's vice chancellor. We'll let you in second place. And we'll get your votes, but we are going to appoint our own man as chancellor. And Hitler storms out. So the first attempt, or should say the first negotiation after the summer elections, is a total breakdown. The Nazis and the old right are now at each other's throats after having cooperated for 3 months. And Hitler is furious, and Hindenburg asks, who is this upstart corporal who thinks he should be made Chancellor of Germany? That basically stalls the Nazis, but it doesn't answer how is Germany going to be governed. When the Reichstag meets in the first week of September of 1932, the communists and the Nazis race to see who can post a no-confidence vote first so that the government can be dissolved within seconds of the meeting of the Reichstag. It never governs Germany. The government elected, the delegates elected in the summer of 32 sit for about a half a minute, and the Reichstag is dissolved and new elections are declared once again. So Germany is in utter chaos, and they're gearing up for yet another election. You've had 2 presidential elections in the spring. You've had a summer election. This will be the 4th national election within 6 or 7 months. You think American primaries in a year-long election are crazy. Imagine 4 national elections all within 6 or 7 months in which violence is absolutely prevalent. I mean, these people are fighting each other in the streets. People are getting killed. This isn't just rallies and speeches. This is politics in a utterly violent tenor. So basically, the calculation of Schleicher is that the Nazis have shot their bolt. The Nazis have gobbled up everyone they are going to be able to gobble up in the political spectrum. Virtually everybody but the Socialist, Communist, and Center Party have disappeared. Hitler has swallowed the rest of the political spectrum. The other political parties are just teeny little fragments of their former selves. But those other 3 parties have held, and it is Schleicher's calculation that the Nazis really have no more growth potential. They have played their momentum to the max, and if Hitler demands another election, it will in fact play to the advantage of Hindenburg and Schleicher, not to Hitler, that the Nazis have peaked and that they're running out of gas. They've been campaigning nonstop. Hitler has kept saying tactics of legality. We can come to power through the ballot box, and what is being proven now is they've hit the wall. And they can't get there by a free election, and that this will begin to cause great disaffection. Campaigns have to be paid for, and the party is financially exhausted. It is in debt. They're having trouble raising more money. After 3 elections with nothing to deliver for it, people's capacity to donate to the cause is exhausted in the middle of a Great Depression. And so the Nazis, in fact, face the November elections in great difficulty. Demoralization within the party is beginning to grow. People are beginning to question Hitler's judgment, saying he should settle for half a loaf. He should join the cabinet as vice chancellor. They have to have something to show for all these years of effort. And so disaffection is growing in the party. Demoralization, exhaustion is growing in the party. And Hitler is reaching a crisis point. But as so often happens when things look the worst, Hitler is determined to basically always go for broke. Almost every occasion in foreign policy, military affairs, electoral politics, when things come to the last crossroads, Hitler basically is the one whose nerve holds, and he's always willing to throw the dice and put it all on the table. And he does again in November. He says, okay, we'll go for another election. That election shows that Schleicher was right. The Nazis have peaked. They are worn out. Their financial resources are dwindling. Their energy is dwindling. And the Nazis, for the first time since 1928, basically show a drop. So they lose 2 million votes. They lose 4.5% of the electorate. You see they drop from 230 to 196 seats. They go down. The socialists go down. The Center Party goes down. One party goes up, the German Communist Party. And ironically for Hitler, the real card he is going to get to play is not that the Nazis were on the rise, but that the communists were on the rise. Because if there's one thing the right is more afraid of than giving power to Hitler, it is getting replaced by the communist. And so Hitler's holding his nerve, in effect, is going to be his key play in all of this, though these negotiations now are again going to have to take place over the next several months. There was that famous James Dean movie, I guess it's Rebel Without a Cause, where you have the two people in the cars and they race towards the cliff, and the first person to put on their brakes is the chicken, and the second person to put on his brakes, if he does it soon enough, is the winner, and if he doesn't do it soon enough, he's dead. And this is the game of chicken. And this is what Hitler is playing. He's racing towards the cliff, daring the conservatives to race with him, and daring them not to, to put on their brakes first before they both go over, and hoping he can still stop in time after he wins. And this really is the dynamic. Will his nerve hold out better than that of the old right? Will they, out of their fear of the communists, basically fold and cut the deal that Hitler demanded in the summer, which is to be made Chancellor? And that's what they argue about in November, December, January of 1932 into 1933. On the side of the old right, around Hindenburg, there is a reshuffle. Von Papen, after this election, goes to Hindenburg and says, I think we should just carry out a military coup. Let's just have the army take over, scrap the Weimar Constitution, and impose a military dictatorship. And von Schleicher, who is the general, not von Papen, says the military can't impose a military coup without at least some popular support. You can't do this in a political vacuum, and that he vetoes that. He says for the army to be caught in a civil war between the communists and the Nazis with no popular base of their own would be utterly untenable. And so in the conflicting advice to Hindenburg from von Papen and Schleicher, von Papen's proposal for a military dictatorship is pushed aside, and von Papen is pushed aside. Schleicher, having been behind the scenes all this time, now finally Hindenburg says, well, what now? And Schleicher basically has to say, well, I'll take over. I think I can find some combination of parties, of people, to create a capacity for the Reichstag to actually meet and not immediately succumb to a no-confidence vote. So Schleicher has to come out from behind the shadows, but he's burned so many people. He's basically cut so many deals and then betrayed so many people that no one will deal with him. He's kind of politically toxic. And his main hope, and it turns out to be his main illusion, was that the Nazis were sufficiently divided and demoralized. Enough people have felt Hitler is leading the party to ruin and wants to cash in their chips for the vice-chancellorship that he can split the party. And his hope, above all, resides with a man named Gregor Strasser. Gregor Strasser was the leader of what some people refer to as the left-wing Nazis, the ones that take the socialism of National Socialism a little more seriously than Hitler and his immediate circle, so that there was some ideological division and also a personality issue, and Hitler simply willing to go for broke, and Gregor Strasser not. So Schleicher misread the signals, thought he had a possible negotiating partner who could split the Nazi party. By the beginning of December, it is quite clear that is not going to happen. Schleicher, in fact, crumbles and goes on vacation and leaves the country temporarily instead of trying to cut a deal with Schleicher. And he is left with nobody to deal with. Von Papen on the outside, however, now picks up the negotiation threads with Hitler. And von Papen now is willing to make the key concession. Hitler can be Chancellor. Von Papen will accept the position of Vice Chancellor. And von Papen will have, to sweeten the pot for Hitler, his banker friends will relieve the Nazi Party of its financial crisis, pay off its short-term debts that are coming due. And Hitler, in turn, will sweeten the pot by agreeing that von Papen can appoint most of the cabinet. So Hitler will be Chancellor, but von Papen and his cronies will form the majority of the cabinet. And this is the deal they more or less reach by early January, and they are spending January kind of ironing out the details for this. Rumors of this are spreading, and there's a dinner in Berlin in January attended by both von Papen, the former Chancellor, now Hitler's negotiating partner, and the British ambassador. And the British ambassador turns to von Papen and says, look, if you want to ruin the Nazis, just hold more elections. Run them into the ground. They'll fall apart. They're bankrupt. They're demoralized. They'll disappear. You can destroy the Nazis. And with an ashen face, von Papen turned to the British ambassador and said, but if we destroy the Nazis, who will save us from the communists? And that ultimately was the key card that Hitler had up his sleeve in these negotiations. And von Papen is willing to give in to Hitler rather than face the alternative of destroying Hitler and then having no popular right-wing base in which to combat the communists. So by the end of the month, the details are worked out, and von Papen goes to Hindenburg with the proposal that a Hitler-von Papen cabinet should be formed. Hitler will be Chancellor. There will be 3 Nazi members of that cabinet, and Papen will be Vice Chancellor, and there'll be 8 non-Nazis in the cabinet. So of the 11 people in the cabinet, 3 will be Nazis, 8 will be non-Nazis. Hitler will be Chancellor, von Papen will be Vice Chancellor, but thinks to himself and proclaims that he has, quote, painted Hitler into a corner. He has figured out how to harness Nazi popular support while he thinks he will remain behind the scenes pulling the strings. He will control most of the ministries, and that he thinks he has succeeded where the far more clever Schleicher has failed, and that is harnessing the Nazis for their own purposes, cut the deal that will allow him to basically control things, even though he is entitled Vice Chancellor and Hitler has the chancellorship. Hindenburg is advised by those around him to accept this deal, and on January 30th, 1933, the President of Germany announces he has appointed Hitler Chancellor of Germany. This is all in accordance with the Constitution. He uses his emergency powers to appoint Hitler as Chancellor. In appointing him so, he has far more Reichstag support than either of the previous 3 chancellors, Brüning or von Papen or Schleicher. This is a move towards a government that could have a majority. And Hitler tells him he will negotiate with other parties to get a majority very quickly. So Hindenburg thinks he is appointing Hitler Chancellor, but Hitler is supposed to be obligated to negotiate with other parties to try to put together an actual majority in the Reichstag, which would have required, of course, the Center Party coming in, the Catholic Party coming in to give him the necessary majority vote. The Nazis, of course, this is a huge breakthrough for them. Finally, Hitler has come to power. That night, there's a big, Goebbels organizes a huge torchlight parade through Berlin. Most of you, I think, have probably seen newsreel footage of this in various documentaries, often replayed on the History Channel, which often is referred to as the Hitler Channel because it has so many Nazi documentaries. But in any case, Hindenburg and Hitler stand on the balcony of the Reich Chancellery, seeing all of this. The 84-year-old Hindenburg is now well up past his bedtime, and at least the story goes, and whether it's apocryphal or not, I don't know, but late at night, watching all of these people stream past, turns to his aide and says, I did not know we had captured so many prisoners. He still thinks he's back in World War I. He's a little gaga by 11 or 12 at night. and that's the man who appointed Hitler as Chancellor. So the Nazis are in this they call the seizure of power. Well, there's no seizure of power. There's, in fact, a tacky series of deals being cut in which Hitler bargains his way into power and does it legally according to the Constitution. Okay, we've got Hitler into power at the end of the last hour. Now the question is, how does he turn that position, that deal he made with von Papen, into the Nazi dictatorship? Mussolini came to power in Italy in the fall of 1922. It took him about 7 years to construct the fascist dictatorship in Italy, or at least not to the end of the 20s that he really has the power of a one-party police state with nobody in any capacity to challenge him. What it took Mussolini about 7 years to do, Hitler will do in 5 months. And one of the most sort of staggering aspects of the history of National Socialism is how quickly Hitler goes from being the member of a multi-party cabinet dependent upon Hindenburg's goodwill to appoint him as Chancellor to being the absolute dictator of Germany. And it is that story that we have to tell now. A German term for what happens in the spring and summer of 1933 was the term Gleichschaltung. And it is sometimes translated as synchronization. It literally means steering in the same direction. Everybody coordinated to do the same thing, to march in step. So the term Gleichschaltung is basically the term the Germans used at the time and have used historically since to describe the process in a sense where Germany ceases to be a pluralistic society and in which political life, associational life is all geared for everyone to march in step, in which everything is done within the framework of a single-party dictatorship that enforces itself through a police state. And all other alternatives basically are going to be eliminated. In looking at this period, the very early study done in the late 50s and early 60s by German historian Karl Dietrich Bracher still, I think, is a very important one. And Karl Dietrich Bracher introduced two terms, I think, that are crucial for understanding psychologically and emotionally why and how this process could have run so quickly. Why people were so intellectually disarmed, so emotionally enfeebled that the construction of a dictatorship could take place so rapidly with so little resistance that it was done before most people even realized what had happened. And Bracher said really the two frameworks you need to understand under which this was carried out were the legal revolution and the national revolution. Now the legal revolution, in a sense, is a continuation of the tactics of legality. Hitler had said after the Beer Hall Putsch, you don't come to power in a modern society by storming City Hall, not when the other side has machine guns and artillery and tanks. But the key issue now is to come to power legally. As Goebbels said in campaigning, we come to the Reichstag like sheep, like foxes to the sheep pen. We come there to do them in, but we will get there through a tactic of legality. And the key now is to use the powers of government which you have gained to transform that government. The revolution will be carried out after the assumption of power, not in the process of taking power. So you come to power through the Constitution, a presidentially appointed chancellor by Hindenburg, and then you transform government itself using the powers and legitimacy of government. And the pernicious of the legal revolution was that once Hitler is chancellor, many of the measures he takes have the veneer of legitimacy. After all, he's the head of the government, he has various powers, and it puts people who want to defend the Constitution and want to defend democracy of taking the illegal step to defend legality, or true legality and true constitutionalism. And so it, in a sense, by being in power, Hitler by default gets the position of legitimacy, and anyone on the outside who opposes what he does is placed in the position of attacking that government and, in effect, taking on illegal means, even if it is allegedly to attain preserve a constitutional end. And that was quite paralyzing, taking that step to oppose the legally installed government, no matter how illegal it in reality was behaving. If it has the mantle, the veneer, the appearance of being the legal government, it casts the opponent into the position of being the rebel, the revolutionary, the lawbreaker. And this will, as I say, be quite paralyzing and allows Hitler to do a number of things. Just to give you one example. Hitler, there is no national police in Germany at this time because Germany is a state system. And Prussia is the single largest state. And Hitler does get his crony Hermann Goering appointed the Minister of Interior of Prussia, which does control the Prussian police. Once that government comes to power, which happens at the same time as Hitler comes in, Goering, using his position as the head of the Interior Ministry, deputizes some 50,000 auxiliary police. Who does he deputize to put on a police armband and become legal police but the SA? So yesterday's murderous goon squad, violent thugs of the streets, now are the legal policemen using those powers to destroy communists and all their political enemies. With the veneer of being the illegal police power officially appointed by the legal Minister of the Interior, to in reality carry out, of course, a very illegal end, the destruction of your political opponents. Imagine using your powers to political advantage to destroy your opponents. Who would have ever thought of such a thing? The other thing that comes in this is the national revolution, to wrap what you are doing in the flag of patriotism. That this is going to be the moment of German rebirth. Germany had been stabbed in the back. The Weimar period has been one of instability, followed by political gridlock, economic collapse, foreign policy disgrace and weakness. If you want to walk tall in the saddle again, if you want the economy to work, if you want the political gridlock to end, the Nazis claim they're going to do this. And this is the rebirth, the regeneration of Germany, the resurrection of Germany. There is a famous propaganda film made by Leni Riefenstahl, Triumph of the Will, in which she is documenting the Nuremberg rally of, I think it's 1934, September 34. And it begins showing this airplane going through the clouds very majestically, and they're playing Wagner and I think the Horst Wessel song in the background. And then you get a glimpse of medieval Nuremberg through the clouds, and the plane descends down. And the script goes, in effect, 14 years after the crucifixion of Germany. And 1 year after the resurrection of Germany, the Fuhrer flew to Nuremberg. And the next scene, he's going down the streets through the throngs of people all doing the Sieg Heil in his open car. So this invoking of religious imagery, of crucifixion and resurrection, of the stab in the back of Germany and the regeneration of Germany, all as the national revolution, the national recovery of Germany, is another thing that paralyzes people from opposing. Who can oppose German rebirth? Who can oppose German recovery? And so these two notions, as Brocker says, help to explain the absolute paralysis of society in the face of the Hitler onslaught. He is going to carry out very rapidly the dismantling of Weimar democracy and the construction of a dictatorship. In addition to those two things that I think were broad in society at large, there are also particular ways in which the different players also saw what was going on and through wishful thinking simply misperceived what was taking place. And in effect, a kind of self-binding. That is, they chose to look what was happening through the wrong lenses, to understand what was happening in an utterly erroneous way, which made it very difficult for them to respond adequately. Among Hitler's old right allies, who are his partners in the beginning, when Nazi violence would be pointed out to them and the unsavoriness of their partners, up until January 33, before the Nazis come to power, the famous culinary phrase was, well, the soup is never as hot when you eat it as when you cook it. Hitler out of power is you'll burn your tongue, but once Hitler is saddled with responsibility, once he takes office, he will be tamed by responsibility. He will rise to the occasion, he'll be transformed by the office he is in, and he'll become a respectable politician. The notion that the office was bigger than Hitler and would shape who he was, the Nazis would be tamed by having, not just enjoying the rhetoric of criticizing other people who couldn't solve Germany's problems, but saddled with Germany's problem responsibility for it, they're going to have to act like adults in the room, not like screaming children, and that Hitler in power will be a much more palatable dish than he was outside of power. Once, of course, the Nazis come in, and the violence, as we shall see, does continue, then the next comforting culinary analogy was, well, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. Of course, there has to be a temporary transition of violence, given all that Germany has had. And once you remove the obstacles to stability, once Hitler has done away with the enemies of the new government, then everything will calm down and return to normal. And then we'll have a tasty omelet after you've had the period of egg breaking before you can get there. So the conservatives had a great deal of wishful thinking that somehow the Nazis that they saw were not the Nazis who were going to rule Germany, that what was going to follow was going to be fundamentally different from what they had seen up until this time. Another justification, another false rationalization based on wishful thinking was, well, if I leave my post, if I don't work for this new government, he'll appoint some Nazi thug, and that'll make things worse, not better. So I will cling to my position to prevent worse. It's my patriotic duty to serve this new government, not to resign in protest, not to resign in disgust, but to lend my expertise to it, because if I don't, the alternative is worse. Someone else will be appointed who doesn't have my expertise, who doesn't have my inhibitions. He will be some terrible Nazi thug, and that will not be how to serve Germany. So the number of people that cling to their posts, continue to serve Hitler, continue to give a veneer of respectability as long as he finds them useful and keeps them around, is amazing. I think one German ambassador in the entire German Foreign Service resigns when Hitler comes to power. And that's the case typically of judges, of everybody else, that it's all, I better stick to my position because the rowdy SA man will get it instead if I don't do it. So you had a whole series of rationales based on wishful thinking and based upon misperception. On the left wing, there was wishful thinking as well. Here, the Social Democrats went back to their past experience. In the Bismarck regime, in the 1880s, Bismarck had passed a series of anti-socialist laws, had persecuted the socialists, had made them unable to have rallies to publish stuff, whatever, and that the socialists had found as long as you kept the organization intact and kept the cadres intact, operated underground, in the end, Bismarck had to rescind the legislation and they could come out and operate once again. So for the socialists, the lesson was duck, keep your head down, don't give the Nazis the excuse to outlaw the party. Keep the party structure intact. Don't gain in illegal resistance. That's what Hitler wants, so he can outlaw you entirely, and he can throw you all in camps and whatever. So keep your calm, keep your position, keep your nerve, and make sure above all that we remain intact, so when the Nazi dictatorship crumbles and this amateurish person in power fails, then we're there to inherit and pick up the pieces. And that was the historical lesson from their past experience. Most of us, in fact, do operate upon the lessons from the past. It was hard to imagine how unprecedented Hitler would be and how different the problem was they were facing now. The communists had their own ideological illusion, and that was, for them, Hitler is simply the sign of the last gasp of monopoly capitalism. It shows how desperate and close to revolution we are that the capitalists would even haul in someone like Hitler to govern for them. And the real enemy of revolution is not Hitler. Their time has come and is shortly almost over. It is the moderates. It's the social democrats, who they call the red fascists. And in the spring of 1933, with Hitler building his dictatorship, the German communists' number one enemy are the Social Democrats, the major defender of the Weimar Republic, the major Democratic Party of Germany, as rival for working class support, and the party they think they have to get rid of if they are going to inherit when Hitler inevitably collapses, as they think he will. So both the communists and the socialists, by utterly unrealistic scenarios that meant they just weren't able to behave or respond in any kind of adequate manner. How does Hitler capitalize on all of that? What are the steps by which he dismantles democracy and creates a dictatorship? Well, the first thing is he makes sure that his negotiations with the Center Party for a true parliamentary majority fail. He does not want to be a chancellor based upon a majority in which if a party walks out, government falls and you start over. And so after a week, he goes to Hindenburg, and in fact, even less than a week, February 4th, he's been appointed chancellor on January 30th, goes to Hindenburg and said, well, I can't make a deal with the Center Party, so we'll have to hold new elections. This time Hitler wants new elections because he's going to run them from the position of incumbent, not as the outsider, harnessing the full powers of the chancellorship to make sure he can win. And so he says to Hindenburg, we do need new elections, but we can't have all this violence anymore. Of course, who has caused the violence? The Nazis. But we will cure all of this violence. And to do so, you must temporarily suspend certain aspects of the Weimar Constitution. What you need to suspend for Germany to have peaceful, law-abiding elections are free speech, free press, and freedom of assembly. Try having a free election without free press, free speech, and freedom of assembly. I mean, these are the basis of the American Bill of Rights. And they were, of course, the basis of a democratic society in Germany. And Hindenburg, without a democratic bone in his body, has no instinct for what's being asked, and agrees. So within 5 or 6 days, Hitler has suspended free speech, free press, freedom of assembly, and the Reichstag is dissolved, and the campaign is on for a new election to be held on March 5th. And without the capacity to have freedom of assembly, free speech, and free press, needless to say, Hitler's opponents are going to be crippled. And indeed, there's a reign of terror in the streets against the communists and the socialists to make sure they cannot campaign effectively. And Hitler thinks this time I will win the majority that eluded me up until now. But even that was not enough for Hitler to think he surely had it in the bank. And late in February, the German Reichstag burns down. It is set by an arsonist, a man named Martin von der Lubbe, who was a mentally unbalanced Dutchman. We don't know for sure that he might have been inserted and set up by Hermann Goering. That's one theory. This was a Nazi plot in which he's simply the fall guy, or did in fact, this is one of these cases where an absolute fluke, a single unbalanced individual will carry out a historically significant act. In any case, when Hitler heard the Reichstag was on fire, his first and immediate action, his instinct, moral instinct in this case, is this can be exploited. And he immediately declares, this is the signal for a communist uprising, jumps in his car, and is driven to Hindenburg, declares that a communist uprising is underway, and that Hindenburg has to give him more emergency powers. So Hindenburg, again, under Article 48, end of free speech, free press, free assembly is not enough. Now, 2 more things will be done. The first is you do away with due process in the judicial system. That you will create a capacity of the government to arrest people without charging them, without trying them, without convicting them, without announcing sentence. You can simply lock them up for as long as you want. This is the law of Schutzhaft, protective custody, that is the whole basis for the concentration camp system. That the government outside the normal judiciary and outside the normal prison system can arrest and hold people at will is introduced into Germany by Hindenburg at Hitler's request on February 25th, and it becomes one of the pillars of the Nazi dictatorship. Needless to say, who gets arrested in the next 2 weeks before the election? Most of the socialist and communist leaders. They disappear from the streets, and many of them are never seen again. The second thing that is dismantled in Germany is the federal system. Many state governments have governments that are not Nazi. The Nazis had taken over majorities or had taken over in combination with allies majorities in some of the state governments. Now Hitler decrees that any state government that does not have a government friendly to Berlin, friendly to this new central government in Berlin, can be deposed, and Berlin will appoint a commissar, a dictator, to run that government in its place. It is as if one wanted to use the analogy, an American president is elected and then has the power to depose all of the governments of the opposite party in each state and appoint somebody from Washington to run them. This would, of course, end the federal system. If you can depose any governor of any state of the opposite party, federalism is gone. And this is the other power that Hindenburg gives to Hitler and the so-called fire decrees. The Schutzhaft and the end of the federal system, end of due process, and the end of federalism in February in the so-called fire decrees that Hitler uses the Reichstag fire to get Hindenburg to agree to. Despite all of that, when elections are held on March 5th of 1933, the Nazis still do not get a majority. Hitler never wins a majority in even an unfree election in Germany. He gets 44% of the vote. With the help of the fragments of the conservative parties, he can put together a kind of bare 50%, but he now does not have outright majority of the Nazis. That still eludes him. And of course, you can't construct a dictatorship if your conservative allies walk or if Hindenburg turns on you. So Hitler has immense powers already, but not nearly enough to be free of opposition, of being sustainable against the conservatives turning against him. So he now goes and argues that we need to amend the Constitution. We need a constitutional amendment, a so-called enabling act. And he proposes to the German Reichstag the enabling act. And what the enabling act does is set aside the power of the Reichstag to legislate for 4 years, invest those powers not to the president or not to the emergency powers of the president, but to the Chancellor, Hitler. 4 years of dictatorial powers to run Germany without having to go and have these passed by a majority in the Reichstag. The problem with the constitutional amendment is not only does it require a majority, it requires 2/3. And how is he going to get that? Well, the first thing he does is after the elections, after he's let a large hunk of Germany vote for the communists, he now outlaws the Communist Party. All of those delegates are unseated, and the percentage of the Nazi hold now, of course, goes up. You have a smaller pie, and the Nazi percentage is now basically increased, and the communists are removed. He then turns to the Center Party, who he scorned earlier, makes them a series of promises. We'll see there's a whole series of negotiations and promises between German Catholics and the Vatican and Hitler between March and June of 1933. The first thing he gets out of the German Center Party is they agree they will vote for the Enabling Act. So the only party that refuses to vote for it, that is still sitting, communists having been outlawed, will be the Social Democrats, and they don't have enough to block it. So once again, Hitler legally passes, if you consider the outlawing of the Communist Party legal, which it wasn't, but nonetheless he gets away with it, so it has the appearance of legality. Given that, you then amend the Constitution with the required 2/3 vote. The fact that there are SA men standing in the Reichstag watching who votes in what way, threatening physical violence if any of them bolt, is again not exactly legal. But nonetheless, when you count the votes, Hitler has the required votes to amend the Constitution, which gives him full power to legislate for the next 4 years. So he has set aside the judicial system and due process. He has set aside the German Bill of Rights for all practices. He set aside the federal system, and now he has set aside the Reichstag. He still has some other things to pick off. We still have remaining political parties. We still have labor unions. We still have a civil service, the so-called deep state, as we would call it now. And how do you get these under control? The first piece of legislation for which he uses the Enabling Act is the Law for the Restoration of the Civil Service. That has a very nice name. Once again, you see that term restoration? We're going back to making Germany great again. We're going back to this good old age of the imperial, in which you didn't have a politicized civil service. That's what this claim is. In fact, of course, he's Nazifying the civil service, but he's doing it under the guise of going back to some pre-contaminated era of the Weimar Republic. And so the first provision of the Law for the Restoration of the Civil Service is that any civil servant whose past behavior does not promise loyalty to the new regime can be dismissed. Civil servants in Germany, many of them had tenure, they were very entrenched, they had job security, and the number of people in Germany that held civil service status with job security was a much larger portion of the economy than in the United States. This was a very important component, you might say, of German society. But now he has a lever over them. Anyone whose past behavior does not offer the security or promise of loyalty to the new government can be dismissed. What does that do? It's open season for denunciation. Somebody told a Hitler joke at the water cooler 2 years ago. If I report him, he's fired and I move up. So one, it means that everybody who knows dirt on somebody who has been indiscreet at some point in the past has leverage on them. And the way you take out job insurance against all the potential of denunciation and past indiscretion is what? You rush down to the closest Nazi Party cell and you apply for Nazi Party membership. Nazi Party membership becomes the job insurance of the German civil service when it is faced with the capacity of the government to dismiss them. Well, so in March and April of 1933, so many people are stampeding and stamping down the doors of the Nazi Party organizations in each town to take out party applications that in May of 1933, they have to close down the application process for 4 years to process the backlog of millions of people that were desperate to get in the party. What you heard after the war, of course, they made me join. I had no choice. In reality, in March and April of 1930, these people were banging down the doors, desperate to get in as soon and as quickly as they could. This was a stampede. And the old Nazi Party members, of course, had scorn for the newcomers. And so these were referred to as the March casualties. All of those that suddenly found their Nazi convictions in March and rushed down to become Nazi Party members and hadn't been part of the days when to be a Nazi was to be involved sacrifice, not just getting part of the spoil system and job security. But it does immediately corrupt the civil service and turn the civil service into a pliant, self-coordinated institution. I mean, the insidiousness of this is that these people are choosing to do this, competing with one another to do this, rushing down to do it, because it is the way in which, because Hitler has gotten the leverage on them with the law for the restoration of the civil service. So it isn't terror so much as the stampede that he's not threatening to arrest people, but he is making them vulnerable to lose their job, and their response is, let me in, give me my party membership as fast as you can. Another group that might be an obstacle to Hitler would be the labor unions, organized labor. If they were to call strikes or whatever and refuse to go along, this would be a source of disruption. Now, of course, Hitler has campaigned in part on Nazis being a people's party, a Volkspartei. We want everybody in. We are a big tent party. We are a party to unify Germany, not to preserve class divisions. And so May 1st was the traditional German Labor Day, traditional European Labor Day, when labor would get out and celebrate and refuse to go to work and take their, what was usually even initially an unofficial holiday, just to flex their muscle and show how strong the labor union movement was. And Hitler says, we don't oppose May Day. We're going to celebrate. Everybody in Germany is a worker. Everybody should take a holiday. Everybody go out and celebrate how much better things are going to be. So May 1 is a big festival in Germany, big holiday. While everybody is out on holiday, the secret police descend upon the labor unions and lock them up and clean out their files. And when labor union functionaries return to work on May 2nd, their offices are shut and their labor unions have been abolished. And in its place will be the German Labor Front. Germans should be divided. Every worker in Germany, from top to bottom, should be a member of the same union. The government union, the Nazi union, the German Labor Front. So basically, in one day, he destroys the German labor movement, and again, he gets away with it. In May, then, one by one, he declares, first of all, the Socialist Party will be outlawed. He's already outlawed the Communists in March, the Socialists in May, and the rest of the parties, seeing the writing on the wall, again, this is Self-Gleichschaltung, coordinating, synchronizing oneself. The other parties, one by one, choose to vote themselves out of existence. We have no reason to exist anymore now that we have a unified Germany under the Nazis. Hitler doesn't have to threaten them. He doesn't have to legally abolish parties after the communists and the socialists. He just makes it clear that if they really want to get along and go along, they should just disband themselves. And the rest of the party system in Germany self-disbands, basically just folds the tent and goes in. The one exception being the Center Party. It disbands itself by virtue of a treaty between the Nazi government and the Vatican, one of the conditions being the Center Party will be dissolved. And it is the papacy that dissolves the Center Party, not the Center Party itself. When we get to the churches of the Third Reich, we will go into that whole episode in some greater detail. But anyway, by the end of June, basically Germany has no Bill of Rights, it has no due process of law, it has no parliament that votes on laws, it has a pliant civil service, it has no labor union movement, and it has no political parties outside the Nazis. Hitler in July then proclaims that the only legal political organizations in Germany, the only organizations one can join that have any political function at all, are the Nazi Party or one of its affiliates. Any political activity outside the Nazis is now illegal in Germany. And this is a one-party dictatorship. Hitler at that point also declares the revolution is over. In 5 months, he's done all of this, and now he says that's enough. The revolution is over. We will now have stability. Let's enjoy this great accomplishment. So for those who have said, you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet, the illusion is that that after 5 months of egg breaking, now we are going to enjoy the omelet. Now stability will come. Now this violence and this dictatorial behavior will come to an end. In reality, Hitler is taking a pause to digest what he has, but there are going to be, of course, more slowly in several areas, still an ongoing coordination, ongoing Gleichschaltung. One of those areas is cultural life. Another area is associational life. In various German towns, Germans joined clubs of all sorts. And these clubs often reflect the social class you were in. So in a small German town, you would have a working class choir, you would have a middle class choir, and you would, if you had Protestant Catholics, you would have a Protestant choir and a Catholic choir. And you all go to your own club and you all do your own songs. And associational life was plentiful but divided. And you have gymnast clubs and sport clubs and so on and so forth. Stamp collecting clubs and anything you name, you would have them, but they would be divided functionally between different groups that didn't mix. What happens between the spring and fall of 1933 is that it becomes clear that those clubs must coordinate themselves, and that you can only have one singing club, and it will be the Nazi singing club. And you can have one stamp club, and it will be the Nazi stamp club. And you can have one sports club, and it will be the Nazi gymnasts. And you will have one soccer club, and it will be the Nazi soccer club. And various associations basically merge and put themselves under Nazi leadership. They don't have to be told to do this. And in particular, if there are Jewish members, it's made fairly clear that their presence is uncomfortable. And wouldn't they be more comfortable if they didn't come anymore, because it's making other people a little nervous, and they aren't welcome anymore. And so you get a purge of Jews and so forth, as well as a unification of different groups in associational life. And so the rich German associational life basically is gradually being self-coordinated from below in this period of 1933. That does not end in July. That's a process that goes on through much of the remaining part of the year. And in cultural life, it takes a little bit longer for Joseph Goebbels, who is the man that Hitler, once he can legislate, creates a new ministry, the Ministry of People's Enlightenment and Propaganda. Speak of euphemistic names. And Goebbels is appointed, and he's determined to take control of cultural life. So in terms of German culture, they create what are called chambers to organize cultural life in different areas. A chamber for journalists, a chamber for fiction writers, a chamber for musicians, a chamber for theater actors, and a chamber for this and that. And then, of course, to practice those things on the stage, you have to be a member of that chamber. And to be a member of that chamber, Jews not need apply, communists not need apply, anybody who's on the enemies list need not apply. And by the fall, basically, German culture has become, quote, Aryanized for Aryans only. Germans and all of the people who are on the outside of the people's community are basically left. They can create their own organization. Jewish orchestras can play Jewish music for a Jewish audience, but they may not perform German music for a German audience. And so professional careers basically are ended overnight. So all of this is a process of coordination, but three areas are basically still outside of the coordination process. The military is still relatively untouched. The churches are still relatively autonomous, and the economy is still relatively untouched. These measures have controlled the political life, associational life, cultural life. It has not yet penetrated the economy. Jewish right to own property is still basically intact. So when Hitler declares in July of 1933, the revolution is over, for many of German middle class and many of those people looking into the outside, this is greeted with a huge sigh of relief. But for hardcore Nazis, particularly the old Nazis, the pre-1933 Nazis, the people they called the old fighters, many of whom have not yet gotten any spoils, any reward for their years of devotion to the Nazi cause, this is a huge disappointment. This is almost a betrayal that Hitler is calling off any further Nazification, any further revolution. Jews are still prominent in the economy. Their holding of property is still there. Most of the civil service is still held by jobs by people who were there before the Nazis came to power. The Nazi Party faithful has not been rewarded with all the things they thought they were going to be. And so there is a new source of discontent in the Nazi Party calling for a, quote, second revolution. The revolution has not gone far enough. Sure, we have political power, but we have not remade German society. We have not rewarded all of the party faithful. And therefore, the demand is for a second revolution. And the man who becomes the sort of the mouthpiece for this is Ernst Röhm. He is the head of the SA. The SA, of course, is made up of those old Freikorps veterans, made up of the street fighters, made up of the people who have campaigned in the streets, rallied in the streets, fought the fights against the communists in the streets. Many of them with little education, who have not been given new jobs in the government, for instance, and with little economic support, who have not been rewarded with the distribution of Jewish property, who feel that they have been left holding the bag, that they were the ones who were the guts of the Nazi revolution, the ones that bled for Hitler, and they have been left with no reward. So Röhm becomes the man demanding a second revolution, and at the core of that is that Germany should be rearmed in such a way that the old party faithful in particular are rewarded. When the Bolsheviks took power in Russia, for instance, they disbanded the Tsarist army and they created the Red Army. And even if you had to use old Tsarist officers for areas of specialization, you had the commissars, the party faithful, looking over their shoulder, given good positions, power and authority, and that basically you had a politicized military to fight the Civil War in Russia. Now, there's been no Civil War in Germany, but what Röhm wants is German rearmament, the vast building up of a new German military, which had been disbanded after World War I, according to the Versailles Treaty, on the basis not of expanding the small professional army, turning the SA into a people's army, into a party army. Now, after the Nazis come to power, people flock to the SA. There are 3 to 4 million people in the SA by 1934. And so Röhm's argument is, what could be more logical than to take all of these young men, exchange their brown shirt for a military uniform, and to create a political army as the basis for German rearmament. And of course, instead of all of these old fogey field marshals, I, Ernst Röhm, will be the new commander-in-chief. There's a lot of self-interest in this, needless to say, but promising Hitler, then you will have an army, a military that is politically reliable, politically loyal, and you will reward all of your party faithful in terms of now being the core around which Germany is rearmed. So Ernst Röhm and his call for a second revolution, and above all for rapid, vast German rearmament on the basis of turning the SA into the new party army of Germany, is the voice of discontent within the Nazi Party. For Hitler, the problem is that the German military, the professional army, Versailles allowed them a mere 100,000 man army, but they kept a lot of the officers as the cadre, and for the decade of 1920s, the small German army has been planning to turn themselves into the infrastructure for vast rearmament based upon everybody in that being promoted about 3 or 4 steps and becoming the officer network of a vast army built up on military conscription. A professional army, not a party army. And so for the German field marshals, for the German officer corps, the nightmare is that they will be cast aside and the professional army will be replaced by a party army, and they aren't having it. So have Hitler caught between a rock and a hard place. The military, which still is one of the groups standing outside his power, with direct ties to Hindenburg, the one group that in fact could depose him if they chose to at this point, says no way. German rearmament will take place around our framework. There will be a vast expansion of the professional army with us at the center, and Ernst Röhm demanding a vast expansion of a party army with the SA at its core and Ernst Röhm at the head. These are two irreconcilable demands. And Hitler now has two constituencies, both vitally important to him, that he wants to keep satisfied, but the capacity to promise everything to everyone is running out. And so he tries to delay. He makes various, delaying maneuvers, trying to avoid having to make a choice, all the way until the spring of 1934, when the army finally, in a sense, lays down the ultimatum. This has to get settled, and has to get settled in our favor. And when they do that, they also open negotiations with Röhm's rivals within the Nazi Party. In particular, there are two people that are anxious to work with the military against Röhm, who see Röhm as a threat to their own position as under Hitler. One of those is Hermann Goering, who is the Minister of the Interior of the state of Prussia, and now going to be in charge of the new German Air Force. He was a fighter pilot ace in World War I. He's going to be the new minister of the Luftwaffe. Germany had been forbidden to have an air force. He obviously is going to build up one. He too knows you don't build and fly airplanes with SA thugs. The Air Force is the epitome of a professionalized armed force that requires expertise and training and qualification other than how loyal you are to Hitler. Being loyal to Hitler does not fly an airplane. It doesn't build an airplane. It doesn't design an airplane. So Goering, on the one hand, is not buying in. And the head of Hitler's private bodyguard, the head of the SS, a man named Heinrich Himmler, also wants out from under the thumb of Röhm, sees the SA as blocking his avenue up the power scale. So Himmler and Goering conspire with the military to supply Hitler with faked information that Röhm is plotting a coup against him. They frame Röhm. Hitler buys the fake evidence, and in June he first puts the SA on vacation, and so they're kind of furloughed off duty, and then using the SS as his firing squads, carries out on June 30th the so-called blood purge, or the Night of the Long Knives. This is the case in which Hitler will arrest Röhm, and when Röhm won't commit suicide, executes him, executes a number of the other top SA leaders on the grounds that they were plotting treason against him, and carries out the execution of a whole list of people who have incurred his wrath throughout his political career. This is the first get-even moment for Hitler. So if someone asks what happened to Gregor Strasser, Gregor Strasser gets shot on the night of June 30th. What happens to Kurt von Schleicher? Kurt von Schleicher and his wife answer the doorbell and are gunned down in their doorway. This is the former Chancellor of Germany. I mean, think of this. What if, say, in 2001, after George Bush had been in power for 1 year, he had Bill and Hillary shot down in their doorway when they answered the doorbell. I mean, this is the equivalent of that. He has von Pappen's two adjutants shot to send the signal to von Papen that your days as vice chancellor are over, and von Papen immediately accepts an ambassadorship to Turkey and gets out of the country. And the person who backed out of the 1923 Beer Hall Putsch and called the army and the police ends up in a ditch. Hundreds of people are shot on this night. This is the first sort of mass bloodbath of people other than the communist and socialist leaders who were dragged off and murdered in the spring of 1933. And this is easy to hide. It's kind of, in a sense, quite in the open. And the key thing is that after it's over, Hitler goes before the German Reichstag and takes full responsibility. Because this was necessary and justified because they were plotting, and this is a measure I have taken on my own responsibility to basically preserve Germany. In doing so, he does not, for the first time now, uses the fact that Ernst Röhm and some of the SA leadership were open homosexuals. And he plays the anti-gay card. He didn't before that. He didn't care anything about Röhm's sexual orientation until now, But in order to sell this to the German middle class, who might otherwise be shocked by murder, you shot down a few unloyal fags, so what? I mean, basically is what he's saying. And he goes to the Reichstag and takes responsibility. Now, one would think that when Hitler basically says, I have the right, without court, without anything, to decide who I want to shoot in Germany, someone would have said, my God, what have we done? What are we stuck with? Is there still some way to get out of this? Quite to the contrary, the response of most respectable people in Germany was, thank goodness he's finally gotten rid of those Nazi thugs. He's finally gotten rid of the iffy, more revolutionary, less respectable element in the party. And now, indeed, truly we will become normal. The blood purge is interpreted by many people in Germany as a guarantee of normalcy, not a guarantee of mass murder. And once again, they simply read the signals as they want to read them, not as, in retrospect, we see they clearly ought to have been read. But the wishful thinking to interpret what Hitler is doing in the light of what they would like it to be, not what it clearly is, does continue all the way through the blood purge. One of the reasons why for Hitler it was urgent, in fact, to settle this issue, not only did the army give him an ultimatum, but von Hindenburg is dying. He's now in his late 80s, and Hitler wanted to make sure he had the army brought on board before the issue comes about what happens in Germany when Hindenburg dies. When Hindenburg dies in August of 1934, just a month and a half after the blood purge, the army then agrees to accept Hitler as not just the Chancellor of Germany, not just Hindenburg's successor as President of Germany, but the Führer of Germany, the leader of Germany. And their new oath is not an oath to Germany, but to the Führer. So the army, in a sense, pays off Hitler by an oath of personal loyalty to him. They are no longer the professional army serving the state. They have joined the cult of personality, pledging their personal honor as military officers to the new glorified leader, and a major step in the self-coordination of the German officer corps that will continue has been taken. So certainly by the point then, Hitler, once the army is on board, there is no alternative to Hitler. There is no way to undo Hitler from within. And the construction of the dictatorship continue apace. Now, one of the issues that sort of emerged, certainly at the Nuremberg trials, but thereafter, was to try to get a sense of what the nature of this dictatorship was. Now, in German propaganda, very clearly, Hitler constantly harped on the fact that it was Ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer. One nation, one people, one leader. And this was a monolithic unity. Everybody was on board. All of the festivals, all of the rituals, all of the symbols to create the visual appearance of total unity. And if you see Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, the whole thing is orchestrated to show Germany in step from these mass fields of men in uniform all lined up in perfect formations, all of Germany both adulating Hitler and marching in step. In reality, this is a myth, a successful myth in the sense that Hitler was able to get this image created and Goebbels get it created and to have many people assume that the myth was in fact reality. By the time we got to the Nuremberg trials and you began to get various Nazis ratting out each other after the collapse of the dictatorship and the paperwork of the various kind of internecine struggles that continued within the Nazi regime. If you suppress everything into one party, all that happens, of course, is all the policy differences get fought out within the party rather than between different factions or parties, and that there was nothing like Ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer in Germany, even though that was proclaimed. So various historians and political scientists have tried to create the model of what the Nazi dictatorship was in reality as opposed to in myth. So we can understand, in a sense, why it functioned the way it did. And the first was to kind of look at the Soviet model. And there, of course, we know you had a hierarchy of offices that were the party, and you had the Politburo and the head of the party and the chairman of the Politburo, and then you had the government structures, and that you had various people holding government positions. And you had these kind of two structures side by side. And of course, the party was the real power, and the government structure is simply there to implement. So something somewhat like that was envisaged with the notion of Nazi Germany being a dual state. And here the notion was that continuing in Germany, the old court system remained in place, the old educational system remained in place, the civil service remained in place, the government ministries remained in place, so you added some like the People's Enlightenment and Propaganda, and many of the old laws remained in place, and so the traditional state continued to function, but side by side with the traditional state was what someone called the prerogative state, the state of Hitler's arbitrary rule. Here is where you had the secret police as opposed to the career police. Here is where you had the concentration camps as opposed to the state prisons. Here is where people could do things by a totally different set of rules. So you had two different things operating in Germany side by side. The traditional state operating by the traditional rules and keeping up the appearances, and next to it was the state of the secret police and the concentration camps, and operating totally by the unchecked decisions of Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, and those people wielding power within the prerogative state. So the notion was, it says you had a dual state. You had the traditional state and you had the Nazi state, and the two operated together, but side by side. Hitler is, in a sense, the head of both. But when he really wants to do things nasty, he will do it through the prerogative state. When he wants to keep people reassured, he does things through the traditional state. But that tight kind of side by side also didn't reflect reality. And so the Columbia political scientist, a man named Franz Neumann, said, no, it's more complex than that. And so in the middle of the war, even before the Nazi regime has been conquered, he says you really have four pillars of power in Nazi Germany. And what happens in Nazi Germany depends upon how these four pillars of power work out their alliances and their differences. And the four pillars of power in Nazi Germany, the industry, the capital of industry, the economy, the military, and the party. And four groups: party, army, or military, industry, and bureaucracy, civil service, basically are the four power blocks in Germany, and that Hitler balances them against each other, plays them off against each other, and they fight each other, and they ally with each other. And that is the political process that sort of is going to decide what Germany does and what Germany did under the Third Reich. So instead of a dual system, you have a quadripartite system, four pillars of power, according to Franz Neumann. Even that, it would turn out, was too tidy. And so in the 1950s, the American historian Robert Cale said, no, that doesn't really capture things. What you really have in Germany is what he called neo-feudalism. Now, to know what neo-feudalism, you have to know what feudalism is. And this takes us back to the Middle Ages, when all state power had crumbled. You didn't have, the Roman Empire had collapsed, and Europe had broken into a whole series of little mini-UN ruled by various dukes and barons and counts and whatever, each with his own private army, his feudal army of knights, and owing allegiance of vaguer or more stringent sorts to the man up above him, depending upon what he could get away with and what he couldn't. Marriage alliances being contracted between, that's what daughters were useful for, is sending off to make an alliance with your neighbor or someone else, or the man beyond your neighbor, so you could encircle him. And what this was a situation of constant power flux. With each generation, one particular duke may be more powerful and build up a feudal army and conquer some of his neighbors, and the next generation, the degenerate son, may not be nearly as successful, and in turn he will decline and somebody else will rise. This was political social Darwinism. in which you had this constant, this constant undefined political structure in which everything is in constant flux. Power is held, and political power is exercised through personal ties. Knights with fealty to their feudal overlord, the feudal overlord with his loyalty to his duke or king above him, and basically this mishmash constantly changing, and no way at any point in time to kind of diagram this or to put it into a fixed model that would say this is how government runs. And that's what Kahle argued reflected Nazi Germany. Hitler is kind of like the top of the feudal pyramid, and he surrounds himself with his coterie of dukes, Goering, Himmler, and others. And each of these is a little empire builder in his own right, building up his own feudal domain by finding his own followers, and Hitler favoring or changing the balance between them when he gives out various grants of power, various feudal benefices, if we wanted to use the term, to various of his followers in for reward for what they've done or in anticipation of what they will do. So Hitler's at the top, and he has personal ties to the people around him. They have personal ties to the people below them, and they're all cutting deals, and that power is shifting depending upon who can manage what. And so in the end, you've got a system, basically, in which, say, a man like Himmler, the reason he rises to be the second most powerful man in the Third Reich is not because he controls one pillar of Neumann's empire, or Neumann's system. It's because he has a power base in each of those pillars. That Himmler starts out with a party position. He is the head of the SS, an elite formation in the party as Hitler's bodyguard. He builds that up as his party base. He is Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS. The next thing he gets is a state position. The German police are an institution of the German state. He becomes Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, and Chief of German Police. He centralizes the German police and takes over all the professional police of Germany in addition to the SS. Then he becomes Himmler, head of the Waffen-SS, the private army created out of the SS, which gives him his own military. And then he creates the concentration camps with all of its labor, and he rents out his slave labor to various people in the economy and creates various industries in his own camps, and he has his own economic empire. So what makes Himmler so powerful is not that he has one pillar of Franz Neumann. He's managed to build empires in each of these areas, and insofar as people have the broadest base and have built the biggest little empires under Hitler, they become more powerful. The way they get that is by Hitler giving them grants of power, and Hitler gives them grants of power because they anticipate what he wants and does for him what he wants better than anyone else. So you have this social Darwinist system of a struggle for survival among the Nazis, in which you have competing Nazis, each trying to build up his own support, but does it by virtue of serving Hitler better than others. So Hitler presides over the top, and he doesn't preside over it as a micromanager. And he does not preside over it by issuing clear orders down the system. On the contrary, he presides over this by basically playing off these different people, rewarding different people at different times, and letting them go and experiment. And those that work out well, he gives them more power. Those that fail fall by the wayside and basically slip into obscurity. So you have different Nazis that at different times in the history of the Third Reich are more or less powerful, experience rise, experience fall, and the whole thing is, in a sense, in constant motion. We will look at these at the beginning of next period, the three historians I still haven't talked about, Broszat, Moms, and Kershaw, and then we will get into Nazi Jewish policy.